Ancient History 206, Lesson 12, the Middle Bronze Age Migration, which may actually be somewhat of an oversimplification of the topics we're going to discuss today. Um, we're looking at the period of the Ur-3 dynasty collapse, and we're looking at what led to that, because it was that collapse which really began the migration westward for so many peoples, including possibly the family of Abraham. We're also going to be looking at the relationship of the Elamites, the ancient Persians or Iranians, to what happened in Sumer at this time, leading again to that migration. And we're going to be looking at the end of the Gutian invasion again. And of course, we'll be talking about the kings of Ur and Uruk. And we'll be looking at what happened as that dynasty fell and they began to be invaded by Amorites and Elamites. So that's really the topic for today. As you know, if you're caught up on your reading, if you have been reading in Breasted's book, that's what it looks like without a fly cover, at least the old version. If you've been reading in Breasted's book, I think it's interesting that he kind of skims over a lot of this area and really quickly gets to the time of Hammurabi, which we'll discuss tomorrow. Or he prefers the alternate spelling Hammurabi, but I assure you that is the same guy, Hammurabi the Great. I think he's skipping over some important people in the time period and in the region that I don't want to skip over. So we're going to spend some time looking with Bauer at some of those other players today. This, as you may recall from last week, is Abraham's journey and the Exodus. So it's interesting because if you look at the migration pattern that we expect Abram and Terah's family would have followed from Ur through Babylon to Mari and up to Haran, and then, of course, from Haran to Carchemish and down into the Promised Land, beginning at Shechem for Abraham. It's interesting because this is very much the migration pattern that was being followed by people as they were leaving Ur during the time of the Great Famine that we read about in our assigned reading this week. So I wanted to show you that this is a similar migration pattern. If you're looking at the dynasty of Ur-3, or the dynasty of Ur, the third dynasty of Ur, this is where it all centers, of course. This is Ur, the hometown of Abram, the hometown of Terah. This is where Nahor died before his father, the father of Lot. Nahor died before his father Terah. So Abram lost his first brother here. And then, of course, the family moved over to Haran, which is a little bit off map, but over here, near just northwest slightly of Carchemish. So this kingdom actually was a kingdom that from Uruk to Ur were the first two cities of this rebellion against the Elamites and the Gutians that led to this new Sumerian era, where the Ur kings and the Uruk kings were essentially the leading cities, the leading kings, the leading cities of what we think of as Sumer, mostly Sumer proper. That would be this purple period down in the bottom from Lagash to Eridu over to Uruk. which is not to say that they didn't also reign over parts of former Akkad, and have battles with the Assyrians and the Marians, but mostly we're going to see a kingdom that expands and retracts in the area of Sumer and then expands out and comes back. So you'll notice that Susa of Elam is right here. Okay. What's important about this is that around 1945 BC, this is where the kings of the east, meaning the kings of Elam and the Gutians, this is where they came, but this is also where they were repelled from. So with that, let's take a quick look at the list of the kings of this dynasty, and then we're going to go to our textbook and take a look at what Dr. Baer has to say about these time periods. The third dynasty of Ur, this is a stela from that period. We're not entirely sure who is being depicted, but it may very well be that this is intended as a family line of Shulgi and his children. Uttahegel was the one who drove out the Gutians. You may recall that we learned about the driving out of the Gutian, what we would refer to as marauders or pirates. They, not seafaring pirates, but pirates in the sense that they were raiders coming in. They never really got firm control of Sumer or Akkad. They simply raided and tried to get control. Ur-Nammu seizes power from Uttahegel. So what Uttahegel does is he drives out the Gutians and reigns for 7 years. And then Ur-Nammu is apparently the governor of the city of Ur, and Uttahegel is in the process of working to expand his kingdom and working to shore up his defenses, and he leaves Ur-Nammu in charge of the city and leaves him troops to do so, and somehow Ur-Nammu is able to convince the troops that were left with him to guard the city to go out and attack the king while he's out of the city and kill Uttahegel, and Ur-Nammu seizes the throne. Ur-Nammu then is the first real king of the dynasty of Ur, because it's his descendants, not Uttahegel's, that will reign after him. Remember, the definition of a dynasty is sons rule after their father. So Ur-Nammu seizes power, 18 years he reigns. Then we're going to see that Shulgi reigns for 47 years. Amar-Sin reigns for 8 years. Shusin and Ibi-Sin reign for an unknown period of time. There are different accounts, even in different versions of the Sumerian Kings list. So, in fact, the same is true for Shulgi. Some say 48, some say 49. We don't know exactly how long Shusin and Ibi-Sin ruled, but the Sumerian Kings list does give a total for the 5 kings of 108 total years. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from Ur-Nammu to Ibi-Sin was 108 years. If Ur-Nammu reigned for 18 years and Shulgi reigned for 47 years, obviously that takes up 75 years, which means that these 2 reigns were very short, and Ibi-Sin seems to be even shorter than Shusin. I know that's a lot of information quickly thrown at you. I just wanted to give you the overview of the Ur dynasty before we launch into some of the major happenings and what led to the collapse and the Amorite and Elamite invasions. So, this is coming up on your screen now. Something you should recognize. This is from our textbook from chapter 16. I understand chapter 16 was last week's reading. I have not forgotten, but I wanted to look at the very end of that chapter again to set the stage. You'll notice that Lagash was the first city to rebel against the Gutians, and this is what Bauer has to say about that. I'm going to bring that up on your screen, and we'll read it together. Lagash's freedom was followed very shortly by the freedom of Gilgamesh's home city of Uruk, where the king Uttahegel had much bigger plans than simply freeing his own city. He drove the Gutians out of Uruk, and then his soldiers, fiercely loyal to him, in his own words, they followed him like one man. Easy for the leader to make that claim, right? Marched in their wake out in spreading ripple of circles to Ur, to Eridu, south of Ur, probably as far north as the ancient sacred city of Nippur. Freeing Nippur from the Gutians symbolized the final freedom of the plain of the Gutian hordes. With his soldiers garrisoned in the cities which he had once been under the chaos of Gutian rule, Uttahegel began to describe himself in inscriptions with a title no one had claimed for years, perhaps since Sargon's sons ruled his empire. He called himself the King of the Four Quarters. He is, in his own victory accounts, the king whose orders cannot be countermanded. Now, I don't know, that's apparently not true, since we know that the next chapter of this story goes that his governor, his chosen second in command, takes the throne away from him. But I would say, as propaganda goes, I am the king of the four quarters, and I am the king whose orders cannot be countermanded would be, good propaganda. It's interesting how much of history really is yesterday's propaganda, right? We're constantly reinterpreting it and reimagining it, and it's constantly being revised, sometimes for good reasons and sometimes because modern revisionists are looking to do their own propaganda. But Bauer records that he captured the strongest Gutian leader, a man he describes as a snake from the mountains, marched him into his court in handcuffs, and in a posture which would become familiar in the reliefs of the next great empire to arise on the plain, set his foot upon his neck. But although Uttahegel brought an end to the dominance of the invaders, he did not live long enough to enjoy his domain. The real snake in the grass appears to have been his right-hand man, Ur-Nammu, who was also married to Uttahegel's daughter, which is probably a lesson best learned early in life. Never trust a son-in-law. That was a joke for those of you that don't have any daughters nearing adulthood. Ur-Nammu, he is the servant of Nammu, obviously, and he is from the city of Ur. He may have taken the name Ur-Nammu when he became king. If that is true, then we don't know what the name he was born with was. Uttahegel has now driven out the invaders and restored order to the kingdom. And that lasted for 7 years, 6 months, and 15 days. Wow. Then, after driving the Gutians out of Ur, Uttahegel left Ur-Nammu in charge of the city with troops on hand. Shortly afterwards, Ur-Nammu sent his soldiers against his own king. The king list records that Uttahegel's reign over his newly freed land had lasted 7 years, 6 months, and 15 days, the only time that a king's rule is specified in more detail than simply years. The precision argues for a sudden and shocking end to Utehegel's reign, perhaps his death in battle at the hands of his own son-in-law. How do you think that went over with the queen?
Well, just fine if he arranged the wedding.
Yeah. Um, Despite this bloody beginning, Ur-Nammu, once in control of both Ur and Uruk, behaved not primarily as a war leader, but as a king. He mounted the occasional campaign against lingering Gutians, but records of treaties made and alliances sworn out suggest that Ur-Nammu's empire was spread largely through negotiation. Huh. You know, it's interesting that there are two different kinds of military rulers in the ancient world. You have the kind who gain and hold territory by warfare primarily, and you have those who prefer negotiated trade agreements and peace accords. David the king was very much a warrior. Solomon was very much a diplomat. Certainly, both are necessary to any successful leadership of any government, but it's interesting that you very rarely see like super even-handed division of those things in the same person. Usually what you see is someone is much more of a diplomat or much more of a war hawk. And I don't mean war hawk insultingly, merely to say that some prefer to sign treaties and others prefer to vanquish their enemies. Although I like what Bauer said, although undoubtedly the soldier standing behind the smiling diplomat had a great deal to do with Ur-Nammu's success. He was one of the early kings who used marriage as a way of creating treaties, right? He married the daughter of the king of Mari. Notice she makes out, that is, Dr. Power makes out, we don't have a reaction of his first wife, the daughter of the slain Utahegel, to this strategy. Her opinion really didn't matter. This is not a kingdom. This is not a culture where the viewpoint of a woman really mattered much at all. He didn't probably consult her before killing her father and taking the throne. He didn't consult her before marrying other women in order to get treaties with their fathers who were kings elsewhere. He also endeared himself to the people by building temples in cities all up and down the plain, including a new temple to the great god Enlil, and even Susa, the capital of the Elamites, acknowledged his overlordship, although Awan remained aloof. So the Sumerians really had their final renaissance, their final heyday during the time of Ur-Nammu. And as Ur-Nammu finished his reign, his son Shulgi took his place, and Shulgi was a very good king who ruled for a very long time. But it was during the reign of Shulgi that things would begin to fall apart. And not, contrary to what might be intuitive, not because Shulgi was not a good king, but because some things are out of the control of the king, right? It was the role of the king not only to protect his people from invasion and from criminal behavior from their own citizens, but also to make sure that the people ate well, that they lived well, that they had shelter, that they had water. So what does the king do when the crops begin to go bad? And if there's not enough grain to feed the humans, then you don't have enough grain to feed the animals. And if the livestock aren't being fed, you don't have livestock to give meat to the people. So if you have no bread and you have no meat and you don't have soil to grow vegetables, all of a sudden famine sets in. Very quickly, Bauer runs through this period. In the Neo-Sumerian Empire ruled by the third dynasty of Ur, the reign of law and order was impressive but short-lived. After his enormously long and prosperous 47-year reign, Shulgi passed the throne to his son, who by then was well along in years himself. That's interesting, isn't it? She just summarized the longest reign in the dynasty of Ur III in a few in really 2 sentences. After his enormously long and prosperous 47-year reign, Shulgi passed the throne to his son, who by then was well along in years himself. After his brief 8-year rule, Shulgi's grandson Shu-Sin inherited in turn. So we've just gone in 2 sentences, one that takes an entire paragraph, in 2 sentences from Ur-Nami's son, Shulgi, and his 47-year reign, to Shulgi's son, who she doesn't even name, and then to Shu-Sin, his grandson, in 2 sentences. Obviously, there was more to it than that, but the significant parts that she's getting to are yet to come. Under this 4th generation of the Ur III dynasty, the empire began to fall apart. See, what had actually begun during the reign of Ur-Nami, or perhaps during the reign of Shulgi, was a slow climate change that was affecting the region. See, they were facing threats from different directions. One of them, of course, was the Amorites, who started trying to expand their territory eastward from the west. The Amorites were, of course, one of the peoples that dwelt in the land of Canaan in the time of Abram and after, but they were trying to expand their kingdom at this time. And I think that's interesting because they were running out of land. Both the Amorites in the Fertile Crescent and the Sumerians both the Amorites in the land of Canaan and the Sumerians in the Fertile Crescent were running out of food. I suspect that when you see in the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, multiple periods of famine, that it was this climate change in the region that was leading to it. Let's see what Bauer has to say. Shu-Sin's reign faced a threat which had been steadily growing. Amorites, the Western Semitic nomads who were now roving along the western border between Canaan and the borders of the Neo-Sumerian realm. The Sumerians called them the Martu, or Amaru, and were doomed to meet them in head-to-head rivalry for something that was an increasingly short supply: fertile land. For centuries now, perhaps for millennia, the cities on the plain had grown enough wheat to support their burgeoning populations through irrigation, digging channels from the riverbanks into reservoirs so that rising waters would flow into storage tanks from where they could be channeled in drier months over the fields. But, and here's the big but the waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates, although fresh enough to support life, were also very slightly salty. Well, let me ask you a question. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to weigh in. What do you think happens to fields of grain and vegetables if you little by little, over centuries, keep adding salt water, even if it's very little salt content, what do you think happens to the ground?
Sterilizes the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, it becomes salty earth, and salty earth is sterile. It doesn't grow well. When the faintly brackish water sat in reservoirs, it collected more salt from the mineral rich land. It then ran out over the fields and stood in the sun. Most of the water soaked into the earth, but some evaporated, leaving slightly more salt on the ground than had been there before. This process, called salinization, eventually led to a concentration of salt in the ground that crops began to fail. You remember the Euphrates and the Tigris run directly into, and depending on the time of year, out of the Persian Gulf, right? It's salt water. So while the rivers themselves are mostly fresh, they're always going to have that little bit of brackishness in them. Okay? And eventually that little bit of salt in the ground led to the place where the crops began to fail. This was a problem for the Amorites. This was a problem for the Sumerians. This was a problem for the Assyrians. This was a problem for the Elamites. And all of these people trying to share the same land began to find that less and less of it was usable for growing crops. Wheat is particularly sensitive to salt in the earth. Accounts from the Sumerian cities show in the years before 2000 BC a progressive switchover from wheat to barley, which can tolerate more salt. But in time, even barley refused to grow in the salty soil. Grain grew scarce. So did meat, since there was not only less grain for humans, but less for animals, who had to be taken farther and farther afield to find grass. Now, I mentioned earlier, this problem didn't begin during the reign of Shushan, right? This isn't something that came out of nowhere. This has been developing slowly over time, and so far, the kings had been able to kind of push it aside and keep finding new ways to keep the people fed. Everything from, we're going to switch over to barley instead of wheat, and that was probably a slow progression over a few long-reigned kings, to coming to the place where they said, this isn't working, we're going to have to do something else, right? So I just want to change windows here for a second, go back to the map, and point out Ur itself is near the mouth of where the Euphrates River meets the Persian Gulf, right? So if this brackish water in the Persian Gulf is flowing in to the Euphrates, you realize Ur is going to have the land cultivated near to it become more and more salinized and thereby sterilized, more saltified and thereby less lively. It's gonna affect the area around Ur and Eridu first. And on the flip side, if you look at the Euphrates, it'll be Lagash that is the first impacted, right? So the cities closest to the Gulf are the ones that are most feeling this. Well, who else lives on the Gulf? And then we come to the Elamites and the Kassites. The Zagros Mountains on one side and the Persian Gulf on the other. They're kind of landlocked, right? And they're now starting to run out of fertile land here and here, which means as the salt is carried up by the Euphrates and by the Tigris, this whole area is becoming more and more salty. If you have more people being reproduced and more people moving in because of famines elsewhere, and you have less land to grow wheat and barley and vegetables, and because of that, you can feed less of it to your livestock. What happens when the Elamites and the Sumerians and the Gutians and the Marians and now the Amorites coming in from the north above where the Canaanites live? What happens when all these people start running out of land suitable for farming? Gilbert? Gilbert? Ah, there he is.
Yes, sir. Repeat the question one more time. I heard some of it. I was typing.
That's all right. So when you have these guys, the Elamites on one side, the Sumerians on the other side of the Persian Gulf, and around them you have the Kassites, the Gutians, and the Amorites, and they're all starting to find that land is becoming harder to find that they can actually plant crops in.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to these people?
They start trying to take out the others.
Right. They start fighting over resources.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a little known fact that should be obvious, but most people have never thought about it. Wars are always fought over one of two things or a combination of them: religion and resources. It is true that Adolf Hitler was a power-hungry despot who wanted to rule the world. But do you know what actually was the...
And women. You can't forget women.
Yes. But you know what actually was the impetus, the spark that started their conquest that led to World War II? The Germans simply didn't have enough resources in the territory that was left to them after World War I. They were going to run out of fuel. They didn't have enough oil. They were going to run out of wheat. They didn't have enough farmland. They had massive population centers, and they needed to fuel their incredible technological prowess led to a great set of opportunities in the realm of mechanization, right? They were really good in the industrial area, but they didn't have enough fuel and they didn't have enough wheat, and nobody wanted to trade with them. And they had all these massive payments they had to make in reparations that were killing their economy. Now, if you were a petty dictator looking for a way to rise to power, what better way than to tell your people, look, it's actually all those nasty Jews' fault. And it's because of those Jews who own all the banks that we, the workers, we, the rightful heirs of the world, because we're Aryan. Remember, it's National Socialism. It's a blending of nationalism and socialism into one worldview. And it's ugly and hideous. But by blaming the Jews and accusing them of owning all the banks, remember, Karl Marx said, the capitalist is the Jew is the capitalist. Okay? What he did is he used the excuse, we have to go conquer these neighboring countries because we need their farmland and we need their oil. Fast forward 90 years. Fast forward 90 years. Why is Russia in Ukraine? Because Ukraine has fields of wheat and reserves of oil. Wars are always fought over land/resources and religion. Um, it's the lesson of history. Now, it is also true, absolutely, that some kings, some rulers, some leaders just have a lust and a thirst for conquest. But let me ask you something. If you're a king and you see the neighboring kingdom next door, what exactly is it you want when you conquer them? You want their gold, you want their silver, you want their copper, you want their oil, you want their farmland, you want something, even if it's just taxes, right? Otherwise, what's the point? All you've done is expand your administrative headaches. At the end of the day, it always comes down to this. This is also taking a lesson from history and applying it to the Bible. If you read Genesis and you read the time of Abraham and the wars that were happening between these kings, which, by the way, the battle of Sodom that was recorded in Genesis, that where Abram had to go rescue Lot. Remember, it was kings from over here, from Elam, Babylon, and Sumer, battling against Canaanite kings, right? What were they fighting over? Well, remember, in the days of Abram, there was a famine in the area. The area meaning all of this. Oh, wait, you can't see what I'm doing. Right? All of this. So from Canaan all the way down to Egypt, all the way over to Akkad, they were experiencing this famine. Now, think about this. When Jesus described in the Olivet Discourse on his final sermon from the Mount of Olives, what the world was going to be like at the end, when John the Beloved wrote the revelation of Jesus Christ, and he told us about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, notice the similarities between Jesus' prophecy and his. War, famine, disease, and what was the last one? Earthquakes. We can't cause earthquakes very easily. We might with enough, nuclear bombs inside a volcano, but we don't really have a lot of good ways to cause earthquakes. But look at those first three. You have wars, you have famine, and you have disease. Okay? Well, it's interesting because Jesus said, nation shall rise up against nation, against epi, on or upon. People groups rising up on top of each other. Overcrowding in an area with limited resources. Overpopulation of a zone. Well, now it's going to become global overpopulation. And what happened here 4,000 years ago is what's going to set the stage for the rise of the Antichrist. What happened in Germany is what's going to set the stage for the rise of the Antichrist. What you're going to see is famine and disease brought about by too many people in too small a space and not enough resources to feed everyone. That leads to people getting sick and people going hungry. And then what? Well, then wars over resources break out. And then somebody has to rise up and be the leader. So, what do you think, honestly, aside from just pure tribal hatred that goes back 4,000 years, what do you think the kingdoms that are now today known as Iraq and Iran, what do you think these kingdoms really want in Israel? Israel is a breadbasket. It's weird. It's a desert whenever the Israelites aren't there. But They grow wheat. They grow maize corn, New World corn. They have good pasture lands. It's an area where there are resources. But you know what the greatest resource in all of Israel might be? Anyone? It's not oil. They got plenty of that over here, right? What do you think it might be? I mean, besides spiritual resources like, they're the people of God. I mean, they're natural resource. There are millions and millions of gallons of fresh water beneath Israel. Beneath, underground, in underground aqueducts, natural aqueducts. Go look it up later. And literally, a lot of it, they're still trying to figure out how to dig deep enough, how to drill down far enough to access. It's like there are rivers of water under Jerusalem. By the way, think about this. What's going to happen in the millennial kingdom after Jesus returns? Israel is going to flourish like never before. Well, when Jesus comes to the Mount of Olives, he's going to split it right open, right? It's going to be massive earthquakes that accompany his return. What do you think happens in Israel when you have massive earthquakes and you've got sedimentary layers of rock that are holding back a river of fresh water underneath? What happens is that water can now get unlocked because that rock gets broken up and it begins to seep up. So I maintain that religion, here you have the Islamists, here you have the Judaists, and resources are the source of this conflict. And pure hatred of Jews, that's a global phenomenon. There's nowhere on earth that you won't find it. So, let's get back to our topic for the day, though, and go back to the time of the Ur III dynasty. So, returning our attention back to Dr. Bear, or Mrs. Bear if you prefer. Oops, that is not what I just intended to do. Change windows and go to there. All right. So here's the problem. Right around the reign of Shushan, a Sumerian scribe notes that the earth in certain fields has turned white. What causes dirt to turn white, Kevin? Don't say snow.
What is snow? I live in a desert. Generally salt.
Salt. Yeah. By the way, you're very faint. I don't know if anyone else has trouble hearing you, Kevin, but you're very faint.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. The occasional proverb shows that the problem of rising salt was on farmers' minds. In a collection from the same time, one proverb asks, since beggars don't even know enough to sow barley, how can they possibly sow wheat? Another proverb remarks that only a male rising of the river, presumably a particularly powerful one, will consume the salt in the soil. So the farmers of Sumer were not so ignorant of basic agriculture that they did not understand the problem. See, I know you guys hear me say this all the time, but the ancient peoples were not stupid, right? They probably knew more about a lot of things than we do. Most of them were multilingual. They knew that they were having trouble getting their crops to grow. The only solution was to avoid planting every other year in a practice called weed fallowing, allowing weeds with deep roots to grow, lowering the water table, and allowing salt to wash back down beneath the topsoil. In the meantime, if you cut your wheat production and your barley production in half, because every year you're only using half the fields, what would the cities of Sumer eat? And how would the increasingly strict tax burden made necessary by a large and highly structured bureaucracy organized by Shulgi in his long 47-year reign, preserved by his heirs, be shouldered? Right? If you can't do weed fallowing because you got to feed all the people, the fields could grow toxic. And then nobody would be able to eat, and the cities would have to be abandoned because the fields would have to be entirely abandoned. You could have to, if you don't do the weed fallowing in the short term, in the long term, you're going to have to leave the fields entirely for, a generation, maybe 50 years, as she points out. And at this stupidly bad time, here come the Amorites to take your land. This was not a matter of pride. This was not a matter of wounded ego. This was life and death. The people of the Mesopotamian plain, the land between the two rivers, their lives and their families were at stake. They could not let these Amorites take their farmland, or they would die. It is what anthropologists call circumscribed agricultural land, sharply defined by surrounding mountains and desert. The growing scarcity of grain made the Sumerian population generally hungrier, less healthy, more fractious, and less able to defend itself. Lacking the full measure of grain tax, the court of the Ur-3 dynasty could not pay its soldiers. The trespassing Amorites could not be easily driven away. It's a perfect storm. The Amorites weren't stupid either, right? What better time to hit the Sumerians than when they were starving to death? So, Shusin, in the first 3 years of his reign, started losing more and more and more of his outer kingdom, his frontier. By the 4th year, he was desperate enough to try a brand new strategy, a new strategy that had never been used before. He ordered a huge wall, 170 miles long, built across the plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in a frantic attempt to keep the Amorites away. The wall was ultimately useless. Shusin's son, Ibisin, the last king of the Ur-3 dynasty, soon gave up even the pretense of defending the fields behind it. In fact, the wall kind of became like their outer perimeter, right? Well, I'm not going to be able to defend the fields on the other side, but at least I can defend the fields within the wall. But he couldn't defend those either. So, poverty, disorder, invasion, and little pieces of the empire that wasn't really very big to start with began to be chipped away. The Amorites came in at the worst possible time. And they began to take more and more of the farmland, which led to more and more people becoming hungry. And after 2 years, the distant city of Eshnunna, in the far north of his remaining empire, rebelled and refused to pay tribute. Ibisin didn't even have enough soldiers to go and reconquer them. The year afterwards, the Elamite king of Anshan, so here we are over in Elam, the area of Iran. The Elamite king of Anshan, a principality which had been technically free for actually a long time from Sumerian domination, but which had made an alliance with Shulgi. Remember, this is now 3 generations back, 50 years earlier by marriage just suddenly decided to tear up the treaty. And the Sumerians were driven back out of Susa. 2 years later, the city of Umma broke free. 3 years later, in the 8th year of Ibisin's reign, the city of Nippur refused to acknowledge his lordship. Worse was to come. As his power declined, Ibisin had taken to granting his military commanders more and more autonomy. Well, that's a problem. Does he not remember how his great-grandfather became the king in the first place? His great-great-grandfather? He was the governor who betrayed his king. In the 10th year of his reign, one of these commanders, a man of Semitic descent named Ishbi-Era, made his own play for power. Ur was suffering from famine thanks to those salty fields and a lack of grain and meat. Ibisin sent Ishbi-Era, his trusted commander, north to the cities of Isin and Kazalu to fetch supplies. A series of letters preserved on clay tablets reveal Ishbi-Era's strategy. First, Ishbi-Era wrote to his king, explaining. So let me explain. If Ibisin sent more boats up the river and gave Ishbi-Era even more authority, he could bring the grain. Otherwise, he was going to have to stay in Isin with it. This is what he wrote. I have spent 20 talents of silver on grain, and I am here in Isin with it now. Now, though, I have heard reports that Martu have invaded the center of the land between us. I can't get back down to you with this grain, unless you send me 600 boats and put me in charge of both Isin and Nippur. If you do this, I can bring you enough grain for 15 years. So, Power calls this extortion. What's another word for it?
Minimizing opposition.
Okay.
Al Capone would call it, you need fire insurance.
Blackmail? Maybe? Certainly it's extortion. So, Ibisin didn't like it. The governor of Kazalu also wrote him complaining that under cover of collecting grain for his king, Ishbi-Era had seized Nippur, plundered a couple of nearby cities, asserted his dominance over several more, and was now threatening to take over Kazalu as well. Let my king know that I have no ally, the governor complained pathetically. No one to walk by my side. Wow. So Ishbi-Era is helpless. There's nothing really he can do. And he sends back a letter to the governor of Kazalu and says, I gave you troops and I put them at your disposal. You are the governor of Kazalu. So now it is up. Now it is that you did not know. How is it that you did not know what Ishbi-Era was up to? Why didn't you march against him? Now Ishbi-Era can claim to be king, and he isn't even Sumerian. Ooh. Sumer has been prostrated and shamed in the assembly of the gods, and all the cities that were your responsibility have gone straight over to Ishbi-Era's side. Our only hope is that the Martu will capture him. In other words, maybe the Amorites will kill him for us. And they did not. The straying commander announced himself the first king of the Isin dynasty, with his capital city at Isin and his territory, the northern lands that had once belonged to Ur. The Isin dynasty would resist Amorite capture and rule over the northern part of the plain for 200 years. Meanwhile, Ibisin was left only with the very heart of his disintegrating empire, Ur itself, under his control. But do you remember where Ur is located? On the Euphrates, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Their farmland is the worst of all. Over salty. At this point, the vultures landed in 2004. The Elamites, now reunited into one Sumerian free realm under the rule of a king named Kindatu, were ready to revenge themselves for decades of domination. They swept over the Tigris, broke down the walls of Ur, burned the palace, leveled the sacred places, and brought a final and shattering end to the Sumerian era. The fields that were not already barren from salt were burned, and Ibbi-Sin himself was dragged away as a captive to Anshan. That's an interesting thing to me when I look at this from a biblical historian point of view. Because as I'm trying to place in history the time of Abraham, I find myself sometimes looking to where was Abraham during all of this, right? So let me bring the map up here again. All of a sudden, the Elamites, for the first time, are free, right? Ur is being destroyed, and the Amorites are conquering the north, and the new Essene dynasty is ruling the northern region of what once was the Sumerian Empire. Okay? This is important to me because around the time that Abraham, or during the time that Abraham was early in the Promised Land, sometime apparently in the first 16 years before the birth of Ishmael, Abraham encounters a problem. He receives word that his nephew Lot has been taken captive. If you go back to Genesis and you read, there are kings from Elam, from Babylon, from Ashur, and from these areas. All these kings form an alliance and come to invade the central region of Canaan and attack the cities of the plain, right? Elam, up until this point, hasn't been much of an empire. They're not much of a kingdom. They're mostly just kind of a loose trade kingdom, right? They're trading with everyone. They've given a lot of their land to the Sumerians in order to have peace. But now a king has arisen in Elam, and there are kings in the north of what used to be Akkad in Mesopotamia, and the Assyrians are now an independent people. So the king of Ashur, king of Babylon, the king of Persia are all finally in a position to mount that campaign into Canaan, where the Elamite emperor makes them pay tribute. Then they rebel, and then they come and they conquer the kings again, and Sodom is taken captive, including Lot. Is it possible then that we have arrived at the time of Abraham? That this is when Abram left Ur during the Ur III dynasty as it was beginning to collapse? Or that he left Ur because the Elamites were coming, and many of the peoples from Ur left the region and went northwest to the land of Haran because their city had been destroyed. And many Sumerians had already begun a mass migration to that region. I can't say for sure because I wasn't there, but I think it's a theory that does fit many of the facts. So let's go ahead and move down to chapter 20 so we can use the remaining part of our time to look at what Bauer calls the Mesopotamian mixing bowl. All right? So the Mesopotamian mixing bowl. When Egypt began its journey back up to prosperity, the Mesopotamian plain was still a mess. After sacking Ur and hauling off Ibbi-Sin in triumph to Susa, the Elamites had occupied the remains of the city and fortified the walls, ready to use it as a base to conquer more territory. But they had reckoned without the treacherous and canny commander, Ishbi-Era, still firmly in control of the city of Isin to the north. Ishbi-Era needed Ur in order to carry out his charade of establishing a new Sumerian dynasty as great as the Ur dynasty that had fallen. He didn't have much competition after the sack of Ur. Most of the scattered cities which had once been under the protection of the Third Dynasty kings had not managed to reassert themselves as powers in their own right. There were only three possible challengers. Two ancient Sumerian cities that had managed to retain some independent power after the Ur-III collapse, and the Elamites themselves. The first of these cities, the city of Eshnunna, was far to the north along the right-hand bend of the Tigris River, almost as soon as Ibbi-Sin began to run into difficulties. Eshnunna had taken advantage of its distance from the capital and rebelled. The city was certainly a threat to Ishbi-Era's power, but it was also a long way from Isin, and there were Amorites in the path. On the other hand, the second independent city of Old Sumer, Larsa, was right on the southern plain that Ishbi-Era coveted. It too had rebelled against Ibbi-Sin's rule, but its kingship had been claimed by an Amorite. Rather than weakening his forces by battling against Larsa, Ishbi-Era fortified his own city of Isin and built up his army in preparation for an attack on the crown jewel, Ur itself. The city's been ransacked and rebuilt by the Elamites, the Proto-Persians, and he says, I want Ur. Why in the world do you want Ur after it's been destroyed and its crops are in ruins? Well, Ur still has one major thing going for it. Can anybody guess what that might be? Here, I'll help you and I'll put the map back up. What is the major significance of Ur if you have a desire to control the trade and the resources of Mesopotamia, the land between the Euphrates and the Tigris, and the entire Fertile Crescent? Why would you want this place right here? Whoever controls Ur controls the water. You control access to the Persian Gulf, and when you control access to the Persian Gulf, you can go trade with the ancient Indian, Proto-Indians in the Indus Valley. You can go all the way around and trade with the Egyptians. You control the access to the trade partners that are so important to the empire as its own resources are dwindling. So he goes to conquer Ur. Somewhere around the time, I suspect, that Abram has recently quit the city, though I cannot definitively prove it. Rather than weakening his forces, then, he sets his sights on Ur. He took his time. It was, after all, near the end of his reign, perhaps 10 years after the Elamite conquest of Ur, that he swept down from the north, went right past Larsa, and mounted an attack against the Elamite occupiers, an extremely fragmentary poem records his victory over the Elamites and his recapture of Ur from the enemy. And this, in part, is what that poem said. Ishbi-Era approached the enemy, and they did not escape his power. There on the plain of Urim, on a great chariot, he rode into the city in victory. He took its gold and jewels, and the news was brought to the king of Elam. Ishbi-Era had to be content with his crown jewel, Ur, because he never got to attack Larsa or Eshnuna. He died shortly after his conquest of Ur, making his son the king in charge of his now four-city kingdom, Isin, Nippur, Uruk, and Ur. For 50 years, the Essene dynasty of Ishbi-Era and the Amorite kings of Larsa fought it out against each other on the southern plain. Neither gained the upper hand. Up in the north, cities which had once been under the watchful eye of the third dynasty of Ur started to reassert their own independence. Assyria, which had been added first to the Akkadian expanse by Sargon and then to the Ur kingdom by Shulgi, rebuilt its walls and began trading with the western Semites near the Mediterranean coast. Interesting. West of Ashur, the northern city of Mari on the banks of the Euphrates was doing the same. Also interesting. And between the two rivers lay a shifting patchwork of Amorite chieftains, mostly ruling over little patches of agriculture, who wandered and quarreled and redrew each other's boundary lines. And then a little city, insignificant little city, little township, was conquered by the Amorites, who built it into a stronghold and began a ruling dynasty that would become an empire. Does anyone know, or would anyone like to guess, the name of that little city in Mesopotamia that the Amorites, not the Sumerians or the Akkadians or the Assyrians, built? Or I should say, that they built up. Anyone?
Was it Nineveh?
It was not Nineveh. Nineveh's in Assyria, but that is a really good guess.
That's what I was gonna say.
That leaves Kevin to have the right answer.
Babylon?
Babylon! Yeah, the first Babylonian empire, the Chaldean... Yeah, we're not worthy. The first
Kevin's on
Chaldean...
my team.
The first Chaldean empire was actually an Amorite kingdom. The fifth king of Larsa, an Amorite named Gungunum, took the throne after the death of his brother and made his own clay to build an empire. He fought his way over to Susa and left an inscription with his name on it there. He fought his way up to Nippur and took it away from the control of Isin. And then he mounted a campaign against Ur, the pride of the Isin dynasty. We have from this campaign several frantic letters between the king of Isin, Lipit Ishtar, Ishbi-Era's great-great-grandson, so far as we can tell, and his general as they try to cope with the advancing troops. The general writes, 600 troops of Gungunum have arrived. If my lord does not send reinforcements, they will soon build brick fortresses. Do not delay, my lord. The response of Lipit Ishtar to his desperate Ibisin is really interesting. 80 years before, my other generals are better servants to their king than you, he writes. Why haven't you kept me better informed? I have sent you in haste 2,000 spearmen, 2,000 archers, and 1,000 axemen. Chase the enemy away from their camp and guard the cities nearby. This is urgent. But those reinforcements, called for too late, also arrived too late, and Larsa overran Ur. Gunganum had declared himself the divine protector of the ancient city and was commissioning poems that, his Amorite ancestry notwithstanding, promised the moon god that he longs to restore the ancient ways. You, Nana, are beloved of the king Gunganum. One reads, he will restore your city for you and will bring back for you the scattered peoples of Sumer and Akkad in your the ancient city, the city of the great divine powers, the house which never diminishes. May Gunganum live for many days. Claiming the right to restore someone else's heritage, cultural appropriation much? This would become the strategy of more than one later conqueror. So, Gunganum's successor inherited Larsa Andur and decided that he would commemorating his sorry, I just got too far. And decided to add the city of Nippur to his collection. Moving on, because we're running out of time, let's go down to the end of the story. And in 1792, the Amorite chief of Babylon died, and his son Hammurabi succeeded him. Hammurabi, according to the Babylonian king list, was the great-great-great-grandson of Sumu Abum, the first Amorite to build the walls around Babylon. He may even have been a very distant relation of Shamshi-Adad, since the Babylonian list has as the earliest ancestors of the Babylonian rules 12 of the same names that show up as the kings who live in tents from Shamshi-Adad's own list. The two men shared a common descent from those Amorite nomads, which will bring our class today to its final point for the day as I bring up your syllabus. And let me get it on the screen so I can bring it up. And point out that now we have come to the place where we are going to study tomorrow the age of Hammurabi the Great, which may explain why this is the appropriate place for us to break off, because now we have come to Hammurabi. So, any questions or comments before we all go get a drink of water and use the restroom before we go to chapel?
You mentioned the water supply in Israel. An interesting little side note that some of the pools around the Dead Sea fish are starting to pop up in them. They're being spring fed and fish are starting to come up in them. And they're surviving, of course. So anyway, kind of interesting to see the possibility of the Dead Sea starting to come back to life.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think they want from the river to the sea? Because they know. They know that there's enough land to feed the Arab nations if they could just get Israel out of the Holy Land.
And Israel supplied the technology to convert seawater to drinking water and the drip water systems and everything else that Israel's developed since they've been there.
Indeed.
So.
All right, guys, it's 11:10. I will see you all in chapel. Thank you for your attention today.